and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. I see a lot of familiar faces, or I should say a lot of familiar names on the screen. So I'm really glad you're able to join us on somewhat short notice. We just kind of put this together this week. I'd also like to welcome anyone that's joined from an invitation from True Novus, our sister company that provides HR and billing services for the behavioral health industry. My name is Chris Tanner. Most of you that I see on the webinar probably know me. I handle human resources for Ampian HR. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Dan Ditto, who is also on the call. Ditto, as we call him, is our compliance officer for Ampian. And he and I work very closely together all day long. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been receiving quite a few requests and inquiries from clients related to just overall employee management and how to handle certain employee situations in this new and complex post-COVID. I guess it's not even post-COVID, the after effects of COVID and the after effects of 2020, the continued outbreaks, vaccinations, all of those types of things. The list just goes on and on about the types of questions we've been getting. And while I feel like Ditto and I are able to handle quite a few of these matters, we sometimes have to consult with an attorney. So we felt kind of prompted this week to make that resource available to you. And so I'd like to introduce you to Gordon Berger. Gordon has been supporting us at Ampian for, I guess I should have looked that up. I don't even know how long, a long time, several years. Gordon practices employment law in Georgia with the firm Fisher Broyles, and he's also very familiar with various state and, of course, federal employment law. And we've also had the opportunity over the years to meet Gordon face-to-face several times, and we in person, we've consulted with him on lots of matters over the past few years. And honestly, we just love him. If you ever need a really good employment law attorney, he's so great. We would love to recommend him to anyone. And he takes really good care of us at Ampian. He's super responsive, very helpful. And I might have even talked to him about matters that some of you have come to me with. So anyway, that's kind of an introduction to Gordon, and we're really grateful for him today that he's willing to take some time with us and share his knowledge and expertise on these topics with our clients. So with that, Gordon, are you ready?
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be coming from. Welcome, and I hope that what we're going to do today is demystify some of these issues about workplace rules and vaccinations and masks. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get the program started. And I hope that I will be able to answer most of your questions in the actual presentation, so that at the end there won't be a lot of curiosity. But if there is, we'll go from there. All right. So, fundamental question that everyone's asking: should you require vaccinations in your workplace? Well, if you're going to do it, have a written policy. Part of that a little bit, but basically, it has to be a non-discriminatory, in compliance with various state, local, and federal regulations, which by the time we get through this, you'll understand what I'm referring to. Yes, with some exceptions, which we're going to go over, you may exclude employees from the workplace who aren't vaccinated. And yes, you can bribe people, incentivize employees to get them to obtain a vaccination. I've seen folks offering $50 or $100 gift cards for getting vaccinated and showing proof. So there was some question about whether incentives could be at a de minimis amount, because there was a wellness reg that was proposed by the EOC, but that never got passed. So folks are upping the ante because of the surge of Delta and so forth. So I mentioned with some exceptions you can mandate. These exceptions are listed here, which is if someone has a disability or a bona fide religious belief that prevents them from getting the vaccination, they can be excluded. It doesn't mean you have to put them in the workplace again. Safety is an issue, and we'll talk about how you handle that. But we're also going to talk now about what it means to have a disability or a religious belief. And then we have the EEOC reaffirming and explaining that, yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic and there are public health issues, but we're not suspending the EEO laws. All of our federal laws that govern and apply to COVID, like the ADA, are not being disregarded. There's still a law, but we're sort of working in conjunction with what those new rules might be, what safety protocols might be. And again, I'm going to talk about some things recently that came out by OSHA, came out with the Department of Justice. You'll see there's some developments, and of course, as the pandemic has evolved,
Looks like we're having some
and so
sound difficulty, Gordon. Can you just back up about 30 seconds if you can kind of figure out
sure,
where that was? Looks like we're
sure.
having a few people that are unable to hear you.
Okay, well, first I will turn my volume up, and second, I'll continue to I guess I'll rehash what I was saying. So,
Thank you.
yes, the EEOC guidelines and laws that govern employment discrimination, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, have not been suspended, nor are they disregarded by virtue of the pandemic. You still have to go through the legal confines, weighing in the interest of health and safety with respect to what CDC and other health authorities have said. And so you want to stay current. I was mentioning, you go back a few weeks and fully vaccinated people were told it was safe for them to be indoors without a mask. And now we're being told that's maybe not a good idea. So things are by far not static, and we need to continue to understand and follow what's going on. So that brings me to another agency that has spoken on the subject of vaccinations. So, U.S. Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, they have come out with an opinion just under a month ago that basically said that EUA, which is emergency use authorization, which is what all of our vaccines are under now, with the understanding that it's expected by Labor Day that they will be FDA approved, so they're no longer on emergency use. But as we sit here now, it's under EUA, that even the EUA status doesn't prevent public and private employers from imposing vaccine requirements. So now that interprets specific law, but again, it tells you that this is how the Department of Justice is viewing it. Then we've had some court cases, and one you may have read about was in Texas. A large hospital notified all its employees on short notice, I would say a few weeks notice, that you either got vaccinated or you basically could be terminated. It's this Bridges case I've noted here. The court essentially said yes, just like with the DOJ, the EUA risks and limitations, while they don't apply to private employers, and while this applied Texas law, basically said employers have the right to mandate vaccines and terminate anyone who refuses to comply. So if you're not in Texas, this isn't binding law, but at least is illustrative of, consistent with what I just showed you with the DOJ, that it's considered permissive to mandate. There have been other challenges in other contexts. Students at Indiana University who are subject to mandatory vaccinations sued and tried to assert that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, but the court refused to enjoin the policy and said it didn't violate because it was reasonable in light of a public health pandemic. So people have tried to attack these in various ways, and the courts are sort of having no part of it so far. Another question that comes up is, well, is a vaccine like a medical exam under the ADA? Are we violating the law by requiring it? And the short answer is no. And it's because, by definition, it doesn't involve a procedure or a test that basically gives you any information about the person's health, or their disability or their genetic information. None of that is gathered by just simply requiring a vaccine. And I know a lot of folks aren't doing this, but some are administering vaccines in-house, i.e. the employer is contracting with someone to come in and give these vaccines. If you're doing that, as opposed to having the employees go to a place of their choosing, you're going to be asking pre-screening questions, just like if you've been vaccinated, they'll ask you a bunch of questions about your health. If you ask those questions as the employer, however, it's different because the legal standard and requirement under the ADA is it must be job-related and consistent with business necessity when you're asking essentially a medical question. So it goes from, vaccination, which doesn't tell you anything about the person, to when you ask the questions, getting into medical information. That's the distinction. So the EEOC has said, well, look, people don't necessarily want to tell you their vaccination status, and it may not be because of a disability. So, when they're asking their doctor or their pharmacist, if they're asking information, it's not considered disability related. But if you are administering as an employer, it is. And then if the employees provide anything else to you, including any proof of their vaccination status, you need to be very careful. It should go in a separate medical file, and medical files, as you should know, are to be deemed confidential, which also means that access and limits should be put on to persons that are in need to know, such as somebody in HR who typically handles those type of files. So I've seen folks want to publish a list of who's vaccinated, who's not. I've seen employers trying to do other things that I'm going to talk about in a minute that could cross a line or raise legal issues that are somewhat problematic, that in some shape or form identify whether you've been vaccinated or not. So you have to be real careful.
Hey, Gordon, quick question on that.
Uh-huh.
So can an employer ask to see the vaccination card, keep record of that, but not take a copy or like I'm saying, like an Excel spreadsheet where they have all the employees and someone is responsible for viewing that vaccine, but the employee keeps the record and we don't copy or any of that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah. This
Great.
is where I'm talking about controlling access, limiting use. And if the spreadsheet is should be password protected or in a secure server or in a locked file cabinet. If it's done in that way where it's kept confidential, of course.
Right.
You absolutely could. And, for your own liability protection, some folks would take the position, I want to make a copy of that card. There are a lot of fake cards floating around, and just like a green card or other documents you might get when you're doing an I-9, you can only rely on what you believe to be genuine. But if you good faith relied on it and thought the person was vaccinated, but turns out they had a fake card, it could limit liability to prove what they provided to you. So it's school of thought there, not required, but you might put some thought into that. Sure. And so can you ask somebody why they're not vaccinated? One of your employees. As I mentioned, it's not improper just to find out if somebody has been vaccinated and asking for proof. But again, when you get into questions about why, it could get into the disclosure of a disability, and then you have to defend why you ask being job related and consistent with business necessity. That's a tough one. And unless somebody says to you, I'm not getting vaccinated because I am disabled, and you get into this, what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is a safety issue, a threat, a direct threat to themselves or others in the workplace, and then you have to look at an accommodation aspect of it. I'm finding that, general safety and welfare is a valid question, but there are a lot of lawsuits out there over folks feeling like it's an affront to ask them questions of this sort. So you want to be very careful. I don't know that it's important so much to ask why they're not vaxxed as opposed to incentivizing them to do so. If you mandate vaccines and incentivize people to get it done, then it doesn't matter about asking the question. And then you've also set forth in your policy that, if you're not able to comply with our rules, i.e. get vaccinated, then you're not welcome to come into our facilities. And if they don't have a bona fide disability, they don't have a right to work at home or do other things that might be an accommodation. So let's just say an employee shares the fact that they cannot get a vaccination. I mentioned that there's a direct threat defense for an employer not to have you come into the office, for instance, because of direct threat. I mean, obviously, we look at health and welfare above everything else. And, you have to show, obviously, that the person's poses, I should say, significant risk or substantial harm to others, and that a reasonable accommodation wouldn't resolve it. There's a question now, if everybody wears masks and the person's not vaccinated, does that eliminate the risk? Well, you have to look at CDC guidelines and see whether are they socially distant, can they remain, are there times when they have to remove the mask? I mean, there are things you have to think about. It may not be feasible. So these 4 bullet points here that talk about how you determine whether it's a direct threat are kind of what you have to go through to determine whether or not this direct threat can be overcome in some fashion, or is it a reasonable accommodation? Because just because an employee suggests an accommodation doesn't either make it A, reasonable, or B, legally you're not required to accept it just because they requested it. So bear that in mind. I mean, you want to get into what's called an interactive process, like you do if somebody is restricted because they're returning from workers' comp, let's say, and there's a accommodation, they can't do the full job. You look at all the factors. Can they do the essential job functions? And then you have to remember, just because somebody may not be able to enter the workplace because they say they can't get vaxxed and you've now mandated it, that doesn't mean you can automatically terminate them. We have to go through this interactive process and look at what may be reasonable. A lot of folks just would simply say, let me work out of my house. Well, there are a lot of layers to that, which include, for instance, looking at whether or not they have a secure Wi-Fi, for instance, whether there are proper safety protocols, whether they have the proper equipment, or are they a forward-facing position? They have to be engaging with others, including customers. So it's not always feasible, and if not, there are options. Certainly folks have various forms of leave that may be available. Could be under FMLA, could be under your own additional policies, could be paid leave. And if you voluntarily continue to participate with FFCRA, that's the sick leave, they may have leave under that. So there are ways to maybe do it without terminating. And if you just go to terminate somebody, you're opening yourself up to potential lawsuit. As I've mentioned, you got to go through the interactive process. You can rely on CDC recommendations. So if there's something that's current in that regard and it justifies you saying this is not feasible, that would protect you also. And obviously, you don't want to disclose that somebody's getting accommodated or retaliate against somebody because they asked for accommodation. That there are lawsuits over that as well. Then I said to you, we would talk about what is a religious objection. Now, this one is a little more difficult to rationalize because basically the EEOC has come out and said anything could conceivably be religious belief if you're not familiar with it. And you have to look at accommodating. And accommodation can be something more than a de minimis cost or burden. And so, what I tell folks is there are actual websites you can go to that can research what the like the official canons of the religion or the official folks have come out and said, this is our position on vaccinations instance. So you could debunk some of these things, but there may be religions you've never heard of, and there's no literature on it. So you got to be careful and sensitive. I haven't seen a lot of folks trying to take advantage of this, but obviously you can see where that could be the case. And so if it turns out, of course, we cannot get them to be vaccinated because they do have a bona fide disability or sincerely held religious belief, then you can exclude them. And again, you may be able to determine if you've exhausted the means to try to find accommodation, and there is none. Switching gears, a lot of folks say, well, is it a HIPAA violation for me to talk about vaccinations and whether they're vaxxed or not? No, because it doesn't apply to employers or employment records. So it deals with healthcare providers and folks that handle that type of information. So if you ask about vaccinations, it's not a HIPAA violation. And some folks just use that as a shield and an excuse. In fact, there are these notes that people are printing off the internet trying to hand it to an employer saying, I object because you violate my rights, including HIPAA. Well, it's false. So I mentioned too that OSHA has updated its protocols. And in short, it's a best practice. OSHA basically would like to see all workers that working indoors or in areas of high transmission, which, by the way, if you look at the map of the U.S. right now on this, it's almost everywhere. So wear PPE, masks, and ask your customers, visitors, guests to do it as well. We talked about policies, and you can also, like I said earlier, physical distancing. I mean, it may not be feasible in every office, but some folks have spaced desks out further. They've closed kitchens and closed areas, and they've made hallways one ways, and they've done other things that sort of restrict the flow of traffic back and forth. And again, it would depend on your workplace, and airflow and other things go into it about transmission and so forth. So you just have to look at a whole variety of things. And then, of course, you treat fully vaccinated persons now like someone who, previously who was in contact with someone that may have had it or confirmed COVID, and they have to be tested within 3 to 5 days after exposure. Wear a mask for 14 days until they get a negative test result. I mean, that's the best practice. If you have employees traveling, I would do the quarantine when they come back for the same reason, because they're on a plane, it's close quarters, they're sitting with the same people, they're breathing the same air. So all those things tend to create more risk. We also know now that there are ways to be fully vaccinated and carry the virus asymptomatically. So even in a mandatory vaccination work environment, there are risks of getting health problems. And of course, kids of a certain age and younger don't get it, so they can't get the vaccination. They can bring it home from school. They can transmit it that way. It can be spread. So do care is the key here. Now, I put a couple of Q&As here on some commonly asked questions. One is, our local health department isn't mandating masks, but we want to mandate it. Can we require it? And the answer is yes. Nothing prevents you from having more restrictive requirements than local government. In fact, in a lot of laws that are passed only pertain to government employees and restrictions on public buildings, particularly more in Republican states where they want to leave it as a free choice. So yes, you can absolutely do that. Can we fire anyone that refuses to wear a mask or get vaccinated? And I think I mentioned above, subject to the ADA, yes, and it could be a terminal offense. It could also be considered a voluntary resignation. You could argue it that way so that the person may not be eligible for unemployment because they knew the work rules and consciously decided to disregard them. I know, Chris, you and I have sort of thrown that debate out, and I think you could argue that just as much as saying you fired the person.
Yep, agreed.
And then another one is, and I think this is going to become a pretty widely accepted practice, like a smoker, because of the increase of health risk of an unvaccinated person right now, I think you're going to see employers charging higher premiums to unvaccinated persons. So I think this is something that, it's rational it's something that I think from a risk management perspective you should do, because I don't know if you've ever seen a hospital bill for somebody that's been in the hospital for several weeks that's had COVID, but it's got 6 figures to it, and insurance companies aren't covering most of this stuff. So, and then the questions I get to is, well, what are our liability risks? Well, if you're doing mandatory testing or taking temperatures and that kind of stuff, there are plaintiffs' lawyers that are trying to challenge it as a legal violation. Or, and they're going to do the same thing with required vaccinations and claim you violated somebody's rights and this kind of stuff. But so far, as I showed you, the illustrative cases aren't supporting these theories. But nobody wants to get sued and pay the cost of defense even when you turn out to be right. The other thing you have to remember is if you have patrons, invitees, or employees that feel like they've played by the rules, but for some reckless employee's conduct, they got sick or something happened to them, you could face a claim from them that either you're negligent or you failed to take appropriate measures, or you knew or should have known the person didn't belong in the workplace. So you really want to be careful in making exceptions about if there's any doubt the person's not feeling well, just like we were saying early in the pandemic, send them home, tell them to get tested, maybe they stay home until the symptoms subside. The other thing that, since I know there are people on this call from various states, some states do have immunity laws that say either if you put up a waiver notice or you publish something on the doorways where people enter, or if you comply with certain best practices like CDC guidelines, there are liability waivers that you can't be sued or held liable. So if you comply with your state law in that regard, you can be safe. Of course, there are workers' comp claims. I got COVID at work. There are wrongful death actions that, a person died because it was transmitted from exposure at a workplace. Those are problematic because there's an element of causation, even though there's contact tracing where we can find it, where people were, where they've been and whatever. It's not scientific enough. So I think, you that favors the defense on that. So, hopefully we don't get sued. But if we do mandate, so here's just a list of best practices. Now, pay for vaccines if for some reason the cost is not covered by insurance, but that should be mandated at this point. That shouldn't be an issue. If somebody has a medical or religious objection, you just opt them out of the process and look at accommodation. Don't let some frontline manager make decisions on these things. Use counsel or talk to your HR person. This is our day job, right? And, those folks know how to make widgets or how to keep the line moving. You want to adapt job descriptions for things like travel, customer-facing, interaction with other employees, things that might compel mandatory vaccination. Because when you're looking at reasonable accommodations, you're looking at essential job functions. And if your job description is outdated or includes things that aren't essential, it's kind of problematic to stand behind and say, we don't have to accommodate you because you can't do the essential job functions. So be mindful that you need to look at these things and update. And like if somebody's working remotely, clearly their job's a little different than coming to the office. I already mentioned the medical records segregated from personnel files. And obviously just continue to be a good citizen by having a safe working environment and reading up on exactly what that means, whether it's cleaning procedures, whether it's distancing, masks, vaccinations, any combination of those things. That's what you ought to be thinking about. So I don't know if we have time for a few questions. I'm going to stop the share. So if there are,
yeah, there are a couple here that I think it'd be great if we could answer. Let me pop on and see what we've got here. So somebody asked about,
just read me the ones that you want.
1099s or real estate agents. So I think this was way back in the early slides. I think when you were talking about, can you mandate a vaccine or terminate an employee? I mean, they're not employees, so it doesn't really apply, right? Because they're a vendor.
Well, yeah, but in theory, you can sever a relationship with any vendor or whatever. I mean, I don't know if you read this, but there's a large brokerage house that sent a memo to all their law firms that said, we want you back in your offices. So you can dictate to your vendors, hey, we won't
Mhm.
deal with you if people are coming to our offices or your contractors that are unvaccinated. I mean, they can do that. They're not firing them as an employee, like you said, Chris, and they wouldn't get unemployment, but they could sever the relationship if they
Right.
feel that the people are putting them at risk.
Yeah. Okay. What questions are allowed to be asked regarding religious exemptions?
So the presumption is the person would have to identify to you in some manner that their objection to the vaccination is based on a religious belief. And then you can say to them, so explain to me, what the objection is or how the religion pertains to that, and let them give you information. And I would take that, like I said, and I would investigate it. There are,
Right.
like I said, websites now and resources you can use to independently validate it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Then will there be a link? Oh, yes, there will be a recording, and yes, we can send this out. Let's see. The comment was 1099 agents aren't really vendors. That's probably a good conversation to have offline, Dina. I think Ditto and I can jump on with you and we can talk about that.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
then,
I meant to encompass all different sort of non-employee
yeah,
derivations. But yes, I know that. Thank you.
yeah. And then just want to clarify, we open ourselves up to liability from unvaccinated staff by allowing interaction. Okay, sorry. We open ourselves up to liability from vaccinated staff by allowing interaction with unvaccinated staff. Is that correct?
According to the science, yes, but you also have that same risk vax to vax because we can transmit it whether with or without symptoms. And although it's like 10 times less severe of the symptoms or something like that they're reporting on a vaccinated person, you can still get the Delta variant under any combination of exposure to anyone. But that's the point. That's why it's so important for you to be really careful about who and what and where the interaction takes place and explaining to people that this can happen in any shape or form, that as a company you have a responsibility to all.
Yeah, it's kind of going back to like you're a good citizen in your community to try to prevent the spread between employees, between customers, so forth.
Yes.
And then we have one more question. What about in the service world where our employees go into the homes and customers ask the technician's status? So a customer wanting to know, who's coming in and are they vaccinated or not vaccinated?
Yeah, and they're not an employer-employee relationship, so it's kind of like up to the technician and up to your sort of policy. I mean, obviously, think of it this way: if you mandated vaccines and everyone you sent out to a customer's house was vaccinated, you can just represent that, right? You
Yeah,
don't have to do that.
good point.
We're, I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying we're vaccination only, because if they came to your office, they understand that you mandated they weren't letting you in. It's the same principle. So you can do it that way. But if you aren't mandating it, I mean, I think customers are right to ask that. I mean, they can also ask your people to put a mask on, right? Or
Right.
take your shoes off, or 10 other things that they may ask you to do when they come to their house. So I
Yeah.
think it's appropriate. They're not in the purview of the examples I gave between an employer-employee relationship where that would violate like any federal employment law, because they're a customer. So, you might want to educate your folks on how to handle those situations if you're not mandating vaccinations.
Okay. And one more that just came in, I think this is really good. And it's really interesting. Before I say this comment, I just want to mention, we have clients that are wanting to, implement everyone has to be vaccinated policy. But I just want to point out that hiring is really difficult right now. So if, 20% of your staff were to say to you, like, hey, I'm not interested in being vaccinated, so, okay, I'll leave. Are you going to be able to replace them with staff, because hiring is really difficult out there right now, at least in with the customers, the clients that we're dealing with. Okay, and one more question, then we'll let everyone go. Any issues with asking vaccination status of prospective employees during the interview process?
So the ADA would apply to applicants as well as existing employees, because you can't discriminate in hiring or other terms and conditions. So bear in mind that you can ask, but then don't ask why and get into medical questions.
Yeah.
Now, look, there are
And
people
don't
that,
make the decision, right? Can I just add to that? Don't make the hiring decision contingent upon whether or not they have it.
right. Now, that being said, you get people that volunteer all kinds of stuff in addition to that. They'll
Yeah.
say, well, I didn't get vaccinated because I have lupus. Or they'll tell you something that you don't
Right.
want to know, but once they've told you it, you can't like undo it. So the way to handle those things are don't respond to that, and don't, like Chris said, don't factor that into your employment decision. But no, obviously down the road, you're going to have a subsequent conversation if that becomes an employee.
And you could set the expectation, right, with a candidate that we require all of our employees be vaccinated. You could set that expectation in the
Yeah.
interview.
It's just like saying we drug test all our pre-employment screening, and that weeds up people that know they're going to fail.
Yeah. Okay. So one final question. If we don't mandate vaccines, how liable are we as an employer?
Well, it goes back to are you following all the state, local, and federal guidelines?
Right.
It's recommended to get vaccinated. It's recommended to use masks. If you're doing things that are not mandatory but recommended, but you can explain why you didn't do them for a good business reason, I don't think there's a liability that will arise out of that. If you're just being negligent and you're letting people come and go and you don't check anything, you don't ask questions, you allow people to continue to gather and have close contact without any kind of protections or policies that restrict, then I think you have a risk. But if you're doing what you believe is best practice, like if you're in Nevada, it's like everybody indoors should be wearing a mask right now. That's the law,
Yeah.
in almost every the county's there. So I think you do those type of things. You rely on that as a defense. Things are going to happen. Somebody's going to get sick, no matter what best practice you employ, because that's the nature of a pandemic. It just happens.
And I think it's about, I kind of talk with my clients about this a lot of times. It's about telling our story, right? So what we did, why we made that decision, how did we document it? Do we have, good rigor around our process? And have we shared, the right things with our employees? And that's really how you reduce liability, is by those, extra efforts that you're making to explain, why you do what you do.
Yeah, transparency is very important. I would, if you're doing some kind of cleaning protocols, or if you're doing anything else that you think is protecting the health and welfare of the employees, I would make sure they understand that this is what you're doing. You're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are a little bit over time. So thank you, Gordon. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure our clients really appreciate it too. It was good to see you. And if you guys as clients have questions after the call, you want, to engage more with us, we'd be happy to help continue to, work through the challenges and questions that you're having related to this topic. It's a hot one. It's a hot topic, and I'm sure it's not going away anytime soon. So we really want to try to, help you sort through it and do what's best for your business. And thanks again, Gordon.
Thanks for having me, and I appreciate everybody's time and attention.
You bet. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.